Hello, I'm John Ohmer, the Interim Dean of All Souls Cathedral in Asheville, and I want to welcome you to another segment of Theological Thursday. What's on my mind today is likely on the minds of many of you, and that is the fact that yesterday afternoon, Governor Roy Cooper issued guidelines for the state of North Carolina's gradual reopening under what's called Phase 2. And so there's a lot of talk about phases, and I want to talk about phases and stages and places in tonight's reflection. Phase 2 for the state of North Carolina is to begin tomorrow, May 22nd at 5 p.m. The Bishop of Western North Carolina, Bishop Jose McLaughlin, has been working hard with diocesan staff and meeting with deaneries and clergy from around the diocese, and had put out rough guidelines about what a reopening for churches in the Episcopal Diocese of Western North Carolina might look like. And they are still in the process of modifying those guidelines in light of the regulations and the rules and the requests coming out from the government. But he thought it would be helpful to know, and I in turn thought it would be helpful for you to know, some of the directives that are coming from the diocese as we go forward for the near-term future. There will continue to be no indoor in-person worship during Phase 2 for Episcopal churches in the Diocese of Western North Carolina, including, of course, All Souls Cathedral. We clergy can continue to do what we've been doing, which is to gather and to provide virtual services in the church sanctuary for people to participate in, but there will be no congregants, no worship services themselves indoors during Phase 2. Phase 2 is going to last a minimum of 5 weeks, so think in terms of the 4th of July, that will be the status quo that we've been under will continue to be so for at least that amount of time. The diocese will be allowing outdoor, in-person, or other church gatherings on church grounds, as long as those groups abide by health advice regulation, health expert regulations, and recommendations, which is no more than 25 people, and where it's in a space where there can be adequate space between people, 6 feet apart, and so forth. This work continues to go on. Bishop Jose is meeting with the standing committee to finalize all these things, and so we're still in kind of a wait and see mode on how some more specifics might unroll. But I think it's helpful to know where we are in this phase for the next 5 weeks at least. We'll continue to look pretty much like they've been for the past 5 or 6 weeks since mid-March, which is virtual worship, and if any kind of gatherings, they're outdoors and they're relatively small gatherings. That got me to thinking about phases and the phases that we're in, and I ran across a pretty good graph explaining psychological phases that people go through in a time of crisis. So using the magic of screen share here, I want to walk you through this. I found it helpful. I hope you do too. This is a diagram put out by, here's the attribution, Myers and Zunin. This was through the Church Pension Fund, put this diagram out in a little seminar they did. And they talk about emotional responses, growing emotional responses, and they talk about phases. There's at the beginning a warning or a threat phase where people are either feeling vulnerable, unsafe, fearful, and overwhelmed, or they're feeling immortal and invincible and impervious. But then an event happens, say 9/11 or this COVID pandemic, or it could be on a more personal level, some crisis, some event, some disaster happens to a family or a family system. And there's these emotional responses of shock and denial and disorientation, disbelief, anxiety, emerging gradually there can be strength and heroism. And there's this stage I found interesting, which is they call the honeymoon phase, where there's a lot of gratitude, appreciation. We hear about the heroes. There's optimism. We can get through this. We can do this. We've been through it before. And there's altruism. And all those things are very real and very welcome. And there's entering another phase, though, and that's called the disillusionment phase, when some of these more optimistic feelings give way to feelings of discouragement and fatigue. I want to pause there on fatigue. I heard somebody else say that, we've been in crisis mode for at least 8 weeks, and people are tired. You can live on adrenaline only so long, but then the adrenal glands eventually, empty themselves. And so rest is an important thing to do, to recognize that, people are tired, and they're tired for very good reason. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. And in fact, we need to remind ourselves in such times, I need to remind myself that the most loving and caring thing that we can do when we're tired is to rest. People are all over the place. This is not a simple thing that has happened. This is a worldwide pandemic. Some people have lost their jobs. Some people have been laid off. Some people have had to lay off others. Some people are on the payroll protection plan, but working differently. Some people have more time on their hands, and you see all the posts about the cooking and the reading and the creativity. Others have never been working harder. I know this old dog is having to learn new tricks, and even though I've been sort of at this parish ministry gig since 1994, this is brand new in so many ways. And so just learning new ways, even if those new ways are invigorating and exciting and community building, is exhausting, and we just need to recognize that and name it. There's a disruption of patterns. There's a disruption of routines. So all that does lead to fatigue and to stress. It can turn to blame. It can turn to anger, rage, feelings of sadness, feelings of grief. I did an episode of this, a segment of this on grief, and encourage you to take a look at that if that's your experience now. After that disillusionment phase, or toward the end of that disillusionment phase, there begins to be a sense of acceptance, and there begins to be a sense of integrating some of the things that have happened and we've learned into a new way. And you can see that this recovery and reconstruction phase is the longest of the phases by far. There takes a very, very long time to recover. It takes a very, very long time to reconstruct new patterns and ways of being and ways of thinking. And of course, they make an important observation that things can trigger, of course, and start this whole thing all over again, all over the place when the anniversary of an event happens, or when another disaster event happens, or when there's, I was going to say, a resurgence of COVID cases, but it's probably mathematically more accurate to say that there continues to be a very high number of COVID cases and infections. So it's complex. There's a lot going on here, but I think it helps to give some context to it. So where are we now? Where are we now in these phases? Well, I'd say we're somewhere, we're somewhere, let's see, I think I can draw a line here that shows pretty much where we are. We're probably somewhere right here. We are going through all this all at the same time. And I think that's just a reality. I'll go back and forth. There's still a lot of reasons to be optimistic and grateful. We see a lot of heroism. There's still some sense of disbelief. And we're going through all those other emotions of disillusionment. And there's a feeling of acceptance. And so, yeah, it's that complicated. But I want to talk about another phase or another way of thinking about the times that we're in. And that brings me to a second chart. And that second chart is something that I've used for quite a while with newcomers. And that's to talk about three places where spiritual growth, three places where prayer at the very least, but really spiritual growth, growth in faith, Christian formation happens. Three places that happens are in the sanctuary, corporate or common worship, usually Sunday mornings. Another place that happens, if you think of this as a three-legged stool, is in our private room. Jesus said, when you pray, go to your room, shut the door, pray to God in secret. So time for individual, private prayer, Sabbath keeping, solitude. That's a place where spiritual growth happens, where prayer happens. The third place where spiritual growth happens is in a small group, in a neighborhood group, in a small group ministry, something that you're involved in between Sundays, usually. Now, like any three-legged stool, it's only as stable as the legs are equal. And so one of the things to think about as an individual and as a church is, how are we doing in this? How are you doing? And how's the church doing? How's All Souls doing? In encouraging and in equipping you and being a resource for you as you take your private individual prayer and Sabbath keeping seriously. How are we modifying things in such a way? How is it that these virtual services that we are participating in Sunday by Sunday, even though we can't be together physically, how is it that is still a sense of common worship? How is that nourishing you? How is that helping you give thanks and equipping you to be the church during the week when you can't come to church on Sunday? And then one of the things we're giving a lot of thought about, and Millie and Naomi and Kyle and I have spent a couple of meetings talking about specifically, is how do we take this area of the small group, especially the neighborhood group? How do we grow into that phase? There's a lot that can be done there in neighborhood groups as we go through the phase that allows for gatherings of 10, gatherings of 15, gatherings of 25 outdoors. What kinds of new ministries can we form in neighborhood groups as people can gather during the week, connect with one another, and still remain safe and still keep all the guidelines that will keep us all safe. Now, the reason I get excited about this particular chart is that each of these areas of prayer or of growing in the Christian faith feed each other and inform each other and strengthen each other. And what I mean by that is that this unpacks it a bit. If we are only spending time in individual private prayer, but never coming together Sunday by Sunday, our faith tends to become highly individualistic. Robert Beulah calls it Sheilaism. Just you're your own religion. You've created God in your own image. You like all the things that God likes, and God dislikes all the things that you dislike. And so you're really basically in danger of worshiping an idol instead of God. If you are only in individual private prayer, if there's nothing that challenges or questions the concept or the ideas or the relationship you have with God. So going to corporate or common worship resists that individualism. On the other hand, if it was only the sanctuary, if it was only corporate or common worship, and never reinforced, never any time in individual private prayer, the faith would never become very personal to you. You would go Sunday by Sunday, but never really drink deeply of it and make it incorporated into your own personal heart, soul, and mind and strength. Look at it the other way here. If you were only in your private room and you never participated in any kind of a small group or neighborhood or a ministry meeting outside of Sunday morning, chances are you would not be as accountable, and you would not grow as well. These small groups, perhaps, are the number one place where, as they say, God comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. That can happen in the sanctuary. It can happen at coffee hour on Sunday mornings, but it's really these small groups who when you get to know one another, where someone will say something that if you have been beating yourself up too much and are being too hard on yourself, will speak to you a word of comfort and will boost you and encourage you. That's important. Conversely, there may be a season or a time that you're going through where you become complacent in your attitudes and your opinions, in your actually living out the faith, and small group ministries are there to tweak and to poke and to provoke. So it's both comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, and that happens really well in a small group. If you only spent time in the small group, much like if you only spent time in the sanctuary, chances are you wouldn't be making the faith personal. So again, the return to the private room. And then this over here, why do these small neighborhood groups need to come together and have corporate or common worship? Well, if they were only small groups and individuals, there would be a very high chance of cliques forming. Homogenous groups of like-minded people sitting around reinforcing each other's opinions about the world and never walking outside their self-satisfied bubble. So those neighborhood groups, these small group ministries, it's helpful for some cross-fertilization to happen in sanctuary corporate worship, larger groups gatherings, larger exposure to other ideas and people. And likewise, similarly, if people were only in the sanctuary, there wouldn't be as much accountability or growth as there would be if people were involved in small groups. I hope that you find, I kind of nerd out on this stuff, I realize, and can get going, and I need to be mindful of my time here. But I hope that you find those two charts, or those two ways of thinking about where we are, both the psychological stages that we are going through, the phase that we are going through as in North Carolina and as an Episcopal church in the Diocese of Western North Carolina, and then what kind of opportunity that offers us to take more seriously, especially these neighborhood groups. And you'll be hearing much more about that, the formation of neighborhood groups, the formation of not only neighborhood groups, but of groups that can gather perhaps around a book study, all kinds of ways to connect with one another, either literally, physically in person, or using the technologies that more and more people are so more familiar with. And then in the sanctuary and in the corporate or common worship, one of the things we'll be doing over the course of the next 5 weeks is trying to just do a better job of what we're already doing, instead of trying to invent something new, instead of trying to be all things to all people. What we're going to try to do is to improve upon the things that we're already doing with virtual worship Sunday by Sunday. And what I mean by that is moving to live streaming insofar as we can get the technology worked out, and it's not cheap. Donate button at the bottom of your screen. So we need to work out some of the technology challenges there with live streaming. We don't have the technology yet. There's a lot of logistics that go into streaming of a service, and ways to make sure, whether it's through Facebook Live or YouTube Live or through Zoom and some other combination, where we can preserve the integrity of the meeting and not get Zoom bombed by some of the bad characters who are out there crashing synagogues and church services and posting hateful speech and things like that. So there are a lot of logistics to work out that we're working on. So please be patient with us as we work through that. But even with the adult forums and some of the other things, we can do things like virtual coffee hours, where there are Zoom breakout rooms, and other ways to make sure that we're connecting with one another commonly on Sundays, and then providing more and more invitations for more and more opportunities to connect with one another in neighborhood groups, or groups of folks who would like to get together and focus on a particular spiritual growth issue or some other kind of thing that will help them and live out their baptismal covenants. All the while, of course, keeping in mind that third leg of reinforcing the integration of all this in our own individual private prayer lives. I hope all this has been helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Again, thank you for joining me for this session of Theological Thursday. Take care and see you next Thursday.